All right, welcome everybody to Intro to Arthurian Romance and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Gawain, Gowan, the pronunciation varies. You will keep up. This week, I'm going to give you a little rundown on the phenomenon of Arthurian Romance literature. Very, very popular genre trope in the High Middle Ages, and by way of that overall stage setting context, we'll get into a light introduction to this week's primary text, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. We're looking at a fat half hour of talk here, spread across two videos, so press pause, grab a nice little drink or something if you need one, and then let's get started. So, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which I will often call just Gawain or Sir Gawain, is a 14th century narrative long poem. The principal manuscript, meaning the oldest known hard copy, dates to about 1400, but scholars believe the poem was first composed sometime in the late 1300s, probably in around the 1380s or so. The author is unknown, so conventionally we just refer to them as the Gawain poet. Two important things you need to know about Sir Gawain. One, it's an Arthurian Romance poem, and I will get to all about that. Two, artistically, it's part of a specific movement in medieval English poetry that was called the Alliterative Revival, and that turns out to be kind of more relevant than you might think. So, the Alliterative Revival, which ran from about 1350 to 1500 or so, was kind of a throwback during the High Middle Ages to those Old English poetic patterns and devices that we learned about in Beowulf, especially, but not exclusively, alliteration. So, poems of the Alliterative Revival were essentially trying to offer these older, more local poetic norms as legitimate alternatives in the craftsmanship of high literary art to the European continental, read imported French norms that were dominant at the time. So this renewed interest in and use of the old poetic devices was part of a larger cultural movement, project that plays itself out through the High Middle Ages, namely a concerted effort to forge a more clearly defined sense of English ethnic, cultural, and national identity through art. So, figuring out England's unique national origin story and cultural mythos, if you like. Recall, after the Norman invasion, England was really transformed by the French influence of the new colonial regime. This happens after every invasion. A new group, a new culture comes in, and there's this ripple effect of transformation, of influence and counter-influence. So the country that had once been defined as Anglo-Saxon, meaning, the Saxons come over and the English or the Britons and the Saxons influence and counter-influence each other. Now, this country has come to be largely defined as Anglo-Norman. But against every action, there is opposed an equal and opposite reaction. We know this from high school science. So just as in The Guest of Robin Hood, we see we see people reacting politically against this sense of an invasive colonial regime and the foreign culture that it imposes on England. Here, in the Alliterative Revival, and in the rise of Arthurian Romance more generally, which I'll get to, we see English artists reacting against this sense that there's a foundational cultural identity that's being obscured or eroded. Their culture is at risk, they feel. And they're trying to restore or preserve or reinvigorate it by digging down into English history so as to mine out and retrospectively define what Englishness really is. What was England as a concept, before all the invasions? Who were the original English people, or British, or Britons? and who are we as their descendants? Who were the great English heroes, leaders, adventurers? What are our great English stories, basically? Who are we? Where have we come from? And how can we leverage that sense of lineage to shore up our present understanding of ourselves as a people and a nation? Those are the questions that artists, always the culture makers and social commentators of their time, those are the questions that artists were asking on behalf of their people at this point in history, here in the 1300s. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a product of that artistic movement. So it behaves kind of like a historical novel, in that historical novels take us readers into the past, into a specific time and place in history, in order to suggest something or tell us something about the present. They are social commentaries that use history to comment on today. Now, that comparison isn't quite fair, because the difference between a long poem and a novel, like the differences in form matters, but in terms of effect, it works. So, cue Arthurian Romance. We're in the midst of this cultural quest for origin myths and original heroes. And what did these medieval English artists come up with for material? Well, that, my friends, is King Arthur. The legendary warrior king and his castle at Camelot and his Red Cross Knights of the Round Table that we all, or that most of us have still heard of. Those stories that are still famous and beloved today. Especially, I think, at this point, as children's literature, or in the context of high fantasy, knights slaying dragons and stuff. When I was growing up, I loved Disney princesses as much as the next twirly, glittery 8-year-old girl. But my favorite classic Disney movie was The Sword and the Stone, was that other origin story of King Arthur. I love it to this day. But back to the present context. Stories about King Arthur are old as the hills. And they were being actively worked on and developed and expanded as a kind of repertoire back in the 12th century of the Middle Ages already. But one way to think about the role that these stories played as a genre that rose to fantastic, stupendous prominence into the 14th century is this. So your Middle English culture maker, identity seeking, writers got to thinking about those identity questions we outlined earlier. And as they thought, they reached back through their memories and imaginations and all their schooling and everything they've read, and they reached way back, past the Norman invasion, past the Anglo-Saxon period, all the way back to the Bronze Age that we talked about at the very beginning of this course. Back when the island, now called England, was still the ostensibly virgin home of those first Celtic peoples, the Britons. That was the closest these Middle English medieval artists could get to a sense of England's original people, its original social condition. And you might remember me talking about this crisis point that happened in Britain at the turn from Bronze Age to Iron Age, where people started offloading all their stores of bronze goods because that material had lost its trade value. So they're throwing their Brittonic bronze tools and armor and weapons into the rivers and lakes. Hold on to that image. Just hang on to that for a minute. That picture of a bronze Brittonic sword, kind of a symbol of the Briton people, lost to memory at the bottom of a lake for centuries, just waiting to be rediscovered. Hold that in your mind. Now, for all intents and purposes, King Arthur is a fictional character. He's the product of legend and the folkloric process. he probably did have some basis in a real historical person, or maybe a collection of real historical people. But the stories about him originate partly from a body of Celtic mythology called the Mabinogion, belonging to the Welsh Celtic tribes of ancient Britain, and then again partly from a wide array of different documented battle stories and folk tales featuring great leaders who defend the Celtic or the Brittonic people against aggressors and invaders. And there are certain kind of key texts where a lot of those assorted stories are collected and kind of canonized, like Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur. But we won't quite get in that deep into Arthurian tradition. Just understand the composite nature of the tradition behind the character that we call King Arthur. So basically, King Arthur ends up being this almost a Frankenstein's creature, in that he's stitched together out of all these different stories, and his name is applied as a stand-in for that archetypal great native king or leader or defender so many times that as a figure of the national imagination, he takes on a life of his own, and he becomes a character, a persona, the man, the myth, the legend, you know? And that process of turning this shadowy figure of folklore into the known entity that he is today, that was the work of high medieval Arthurian Romance literature. One key point, the word romance, when we talk about medieval romance or Arthurian romance, does not mean love stories. No, it doesn't. Whatever you are thinking about with Guinevere and Lancelot or the rest of it, chuck it. It means adventure stories. Romance, the word romance, comes from the French word roman, R-O-M-A-N-S, which originally meant a poem or story that had been translated from the Latin, the Roman Latin, into the vernacular or common language, i.e. French. And examples of those texts translated from Latin into French might have included stories like Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of England, which, like Morte d'Arthur, is another major source text for Arthurian material, originally written in Latin, translated into French, and then later into English as well, as the stories become just wildly popular. So broadly, the category medieval romance comes to indicate stories in poetry or prose that relate to the legendary or extraordinary adventures of a hero, especially a hero of chivalry, meaning knights and kings. Again, chivalry, that word comes from the French, the French word for horse, cheval, these mounted soldiers, these knights, the culture of courtesy, of courtly honor, of knightly character, that whole culture and tradition comes to be defined by the word chivalry. So, medieval romance, stories in poetry or prose relating to the legendary or extraordinary adventures of a hero, especially a hero of chivalry, but sometimes also religious figures like a major saint out performing crazy miracles and stuff, you know, St. Patrick driving all the snakes out of Ireland. That sometimes can get scooped into the idea of romance. And as a little subcategory under that umbrella, Arthurian romance, specifically, is the genre that entails stories about the heroic and magical adventures of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Like, for example, Sir Gawain. And we've arrived. So one of the stories, just kind of for sake of context, one of the stories that you may be familiar with from Arthurian romance could be the story of the Giving of Excalibur. And in that story, the young King Arthur is riding out in the backcountry, and this mythical woman, the Lady of the Lake, she's called, who's a kind of spirit being or fey creature. She rises up out of the lake, and in her hands, she's carrying a sword. And she tells Arthur that he is the rightful, destined King of England, the leader meant to raise the country to its proper glory, and that it's by taking up this sword, named Excalibur, that Arthur takes up his vocation as the true-born King of England. Now, myths especially, and to some degree legends, are the kinds of stories that work to make a more personally or culturally relevant kind of sense out of the events of history. So, imagine just for a second that you're an English person in the 1300s. You're a common sort of person, maybe a farm laborer, maybe a dairymaid, pick your thing. And you've heard stories from buddies or older relatives about people who find really cool bronze stuff in rivers or lakes sometimes. And you know that they belonged to the ancient people of this country, of your country. But here you are today, living under this French colonial regime, just sort of getting by. And one day, you hear a story about this great and powerful man, somebody living maybe in the Saxon period, who is descended from those first people, the Britons, and what happens to him? A magical earth spirit, possibly pseudo-goddess, a woman who represents the will of the land itself, comes to this man and raises one of those ancient, probably bronze, Brittonic swords out of the water. The sword of your ancestors, the sword of your people. And she says, take up this sword, take up the cause of your people, rule the nation, lead them to greatness and thriving and happiness and all that stuff. Well, you, the French farm laborer, French governed farmhand or dairymaid or whatever, you're thinking, friggin' A. This hero, this guy is one of us. This is a story about us. Awesome. Just like the author of The Guest of Robin Hood, the medieval authors pioneering Arthurian Romance at this time were trying to bring together some smash hit stories about true English heroes and the true English nation, with a sense of its continuous history. They were trying to find stories that would unify the hearts and minds of the people, galvanize their spirits, and inspire their pride. That's obviously not all they were doing. These stories, like all great stories, are doing a lot of things. A lot of things. They're not just political propaganda pieces. But that political nation-building ideological thread is in there, and it's worth knowing about. So now you get the idea. You know what I'm talking about when I say Arthurian Romance. We're not talking love stories. We're talking medieval adventure stories about King Arthur and company, which rose to popularity as a part of a larger artistic sort of uprising. I don't want to say revival, but a real artistic kind of push for new innovations, and out of a larger culture building project as well. So all of that finally brings us back to our text for this week, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I said we were going to spread this over 2 videos, but it's going faster than I thought it would, so give you a minute, press pause, shake out the cobwebs if you need to. On to Sir Gawain. As a narrative long poem, we can kind of think about Sir Gawain as fiction, because the chief object of the piece is to tell a story, and a longish story. It's basically fiction before the conventional prose forms of today existed. But it is still written in verse, so you'll hear me flip-flop in describing it between the words, story and poem when talking about Gawain, because functionally it's both. That said, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was originally composed in writing, with pen and ink. And as far as we know, it was generally circulated, and translated that well from the beginning. So to the best of our awareness, it has always been a text, a page poem. But, and this is really important, the words of the beginning of the poem frame the internal story as though it were an oral tale. A legend the narrator is telling to us, his live audience. Midpoint of the second stanza, the second big chunk, the narrator invites the reader to listen while he or she relates a story that they have heard. And this does a whole bunch of cool stuff as a move, as a moment of sort of literary jujitsu. For one thing, this move creates a sense of atmosphere, right? It gives you the feeling that you're sitting, maybe in a dimly lit room or perhaps around a fire outdoors, listening to a stranger tell you a real good story. But it also plays up the idea that the story you're about to hear is a legend passed around and handed down over generations, gives it a sense of venerability, of antiquity. Even though, breaking up the atmosphere now for a second, even though in point of fact, this story is brand new. Sir Gawain is based on old legends to do with Arthur's court, but this present-day story, remember, the text that you, the medieval reader, are holding in your hands, is completely new. It's hot off the press, so to speak. So there's some illusion building going on here. The narrator is trying to blur your awareness of being separate from the story. They're inviting you to suspend your disbelief. You forget that you're holding a book, while they try to pull you right into the story, as though by opening the book, it's almost like you're leaning over a well, and when the story comes to life in your hands, it just grabs you and pulls you by the hair down into the water, and you're completely immersed. Second, this move of framing the story as an oral tale, it creates that aura of immediacy and presence, that immersiveness, but it also suggests that the story is hearsay. Now, again, of course it's not. This is something the poet sat down and made up and, then wrote down and published. But the author wants you to imagine that it's a story you're hearing from somebody who heard it, and so on. Because that creates a kind of freedom for the author to dispense with strict realism and wander off into the world of strange happenings and fabulous creatures and unknown lands and ghosts and rare beasts and magic. That's the bridge out of the mundane into the marvelous. This same move, framing the story as a retold oral tale, it also calls back, as you may already have sort of noticed, that old tradition of the bardic poem, of the grand recitations in the mead hall like we read about in Beowulf, where these incredible professional poets would just improvise heroic tales in metered verse on the spot, So this piece, Sir Gawain, is a narrative long poem, but it's a text piece. It's not a bardic hall poem like Beowulf, and it's not a minstrel ballad like Robin Hood, but in a way, it's pretending to be both. And that's kind of what makes it a literary innovation. The author is crafting a very early form of metafiction here. And all of that effect, all of that stage setting that we've just outlined is achieved by one very economic gesture. You can almost imagine the narrator taking a deep breath at the beginning of the story and just blowing on the coals of your imagination. And it happens here in the second stanza. And I'll read the chunk for you. More marvels have happened in this merry land than any other I know since that olden time. But of those that here built of British kings, King Arthur was counted most courteous of all. Wherefore an adventure I am to unfold. That a marvel of might, some men think it, and one unmatched among Arthur's wonders. If you will listen to my lay but a little while, as I heard it in hall, I shall hasten to tell anew, as it was fashioned featly, in tale of daring do, and linked in measures meetly by letters tried and true. Friggin' gorgeous, and so intriguing. And that's what leads us into the story. There's all kinds of hidden little Easter eggy things that go on in the first stanza, which is like a real quick recap of the history of England up until now, as in the starting point of the story. We're not going to get into that. This metafiction moment that invites the reader to be immersed in a tale of marvelous happenings. That's where I want to start. And I'm going to give you guys a quick sort of plot summary to give you a bit of a boost into your reading of the first half of Sir Gawain this week. So the story that follows is probably one of the earliest entries in that delightful category of Christmas stories, the Christmas ghost story. It's right up there with Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol or James Joyce's The Dead, slightly different. Right down to beloved movies like It's a Wonderful Life and The Polar Express.